One of the biggest and most important questions that you could ever ask yourself as a podcast host is my podcast aligned with the future of where podcasts are heading? And in this episode, I'm going to answer a great question that we got from a listener asking about trends in the industry that are happening right now. And I'm going to break down what these trends are, why they're happening, and make a few predictions about the future of podcasting that we may see play out here over the next few years so that you can walk away knowing if your show is going to make the cut. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy.
Hey, Courtney. This is Zach from the Your Path to Publish podcast. I have a question for you. Where do you see podcasts going in the future? It seems like there's a mix of podcasts that go super niche, some that are consolidating through different podcast networks, and the number of general podcasts are saved for those who have been doing it for several years. Anyways, would love to know your thoughts on this.
Zach, I am so excited that you asked this question because I have actually been wanting to do an episode on this for a while because there are a lot of trends that we are seeing happening in the podcasting industry right now and in the industry of content creation as a whole. And one of the questions that I get asked a lot is around niche podcasts. People ask me all the time, are they more effective? Do they grow faster? Or is it actually worse to have a niche podcast? Am I shooting myself in the foot because I have a small niche? What if I tap out that niche and cap my growth? And these are all valid questions and concerns. And to your point, Zach, we're also seeing a lot of podcasts become part of these big networks. A lot of the big podcasts are getting bigger. And networks is something that this didn't exist when podcasts first started, but they have become more and more popular, and there have been more and more networks emerging in recent years. But in order to understand why these trends are happening, why they're happening now, we got to go back in time and do a little digging into the history of podcasts. And you may or may not know this, but podcasting was first introduced as a concept by Dave Weiner and Adam Curry back in 2004. And back then, it was the wild, wild west. Think about it. We were just a few years out from Y2K, when people were building bunkers in their backyard thinking that the dawning of the internet and computers was going to ruin the world. I'm not kidding. I had family members who were preparing for end times. And I remember this very vividly because I was like a preteen at the time and I was terrified. What? So 2004, think about that. The smartphone. I don't even think the first iPhone was invented yet. That was probably still around the times where I can remember this. A friend of mine had one of those car phones and it was so innovative back then. It was like the phone that looked like the old phones that were connected to the cord in your house, but it was in your car and it was connected to the cord in your car and it sat in this little cradle. You could basically call a handful of people. Wild to think of where we are now, 20 years later, versus where we were then. And that is a really important point. Why? Because technology wasn't nearly as advanced. Podcasting was new. So guess what? People had a higher level of tolerance. People would tolerate low audio quality because there wasn't anything better. They didn't know any better. I can remember having John Lee Dumas on my podcast a couple years ago, and he was telling the story of how when he first started his podcast, he was recording episodes in his car. In the backseat of his car. Nowadays, listeners are so savvy, we wouldn't tolerate that because we know better. But back then, we didn't know better. And this is true across every platform that we have ever seen introduced in this technological age, and we've seen a similar evolution. When Instagram first came out, we would tolerate unfiltered pictures of people's breakfasts and their cats. But now, if that crosses your feed, it's almost offensive. Oh my gosh, you are wasting my time, unfollowed. And it's no different than giving your toddler an option to say, hey, do you want dessert before dinner? We'll make an exception today. And the next thing you know, suddenly dessert before dinner is an option because you allowed it that one time. There's no going back. So this is really important to understand. Because one trend that we have seen and will continue to see in podcasting is that listeners are going to become increasingly savvy as technology continues to advance. As people continue to put out new and creative and innovative ways to create content and engage audiences. Every platform that we know today, since inception, has essentially been reborn every couple of years and will continue to be reborn every couple of years from now. because suddenly what wasn't an option is now an option. Again, social media is a very easy place to look because things change so rapidly there. It's hard to believe that a few years ago, Reels were not a thing on Instagram, but they didn't exist before TikTok hit the scene. So we're going to continue seeing this evolution, number one. And number two, with every evolution, we have to understand that our audience, their needs, their preferences, their likes, their dislikes are going to evolve too. So why is this important for your podcast? Well, a survey by Edison Research found that 74% of podcast listeners say that they prefer podcasts that focus on specific topics that they're interested in. And then in another report by Nielsen, 62% of podcast listeners engage more deeply with niche podcasts compared to general interest ones. In that same study, Nielsen reported that 80% of niche podcast listeners regularly tune in to all episodes, which is an indicator that niche podcasts tend to build more loyal audiences. But again, in order to understand this, in order for us to really dissect how does this impact and inform what you should be doing with your podcast, we got to go back in time. Because just like technology has advanced, so have niches. In the old days, niches were much broader because there was less content on a given topic. But as every niche has become more and more flooded with content, general content or broad content is now chum in the water. People have had to find bluer and bluer oceans or outlier or more niche topics in order to stand out. So let's just look at my podcast as an example. There are a lot of podcasts about podcasting. Only a handful of those rank consistently in the top 100. And of those, some of them have been around for a long time. School of Podcasting is one of them. Over 900 episodes published. Other shows came later, but they were still fairly early to the scene. The Podcast on Podcasting is a good example. But the more content gets produced about podcasting, the more specific you got to be to show why you're different and attract attention from the same audience. It's no different than books. Okay, we used to have encyclopedias, which would tell you a little bit about a lot of things. But I've never seen an encyclopedia at the top of the bestsellers list, have you? The best books today are hyper-specific in nature. They're honed in on a single topic. And if you want to write about more than one thing, well, you just write another book. Back then, though, you didn't have to get as specific as you do now, because back then, business was specific enough. Marketing was specific enough. Health and fitness was specific enough. So you could get away with having a business podcast or a marketing podcast or a fitness podcast and talking about any number of things under that area of focus. And so this is why today we see these long-standing general business podcasts that talk about everything from sales to hiring to marketing to pretty much anything you want to know about business. They are the encyclopedia podcasts of business. And I'm of the opinion that the only reason they're still performing is because they were able to amass a large following early on when the marketplace wasn't as crowded. And so that audience is now carrying this show. And or they're now part of a larger network, and there's a lot of money exchanging hands behind the scenes that we don't always see or hear about. So what's happening as all of these evolutions unfold is that there's a divide that's being created in the industry, whether you're aware of it or not. There's a divide between general versus niche, between networked versus independent, between ad-supported versus subscription-based, professional versus amateur, scripted versus unscripted, audio only versus multimedia, global versus local, educational versus entertainment. There's beauty in diversity, but there's also a lot more noise now than ever before. So this is my recommendation. If you have a podcast or if you are looking to start a podcast, first you have to figure out who you are as a podcaster. What is your identity? And what is your show's identity? This is more important now than ever as the industry is going to continue to change. Overall, these changes are good. These changes are natural. These changes are inevitable. Changes like this happen in every industry, across every platform. This is the definition of evolution. Nothing is constant. But the question for you as a podcast host is, well, is my podcast primed to rise with the tide or sink. And those podcasts with a clear identity will know on which side of these divides that they fall. So currently, my podcast is a niche, independent, self-funded, listener-supported, professional, hybrid, mostly unscripted, audio-only global educational podcast. And I'm not saying this is right. I'm not saying do what I do. I'm not saying this is wrong, because every show is different. What matters is you got to figure out what your identity is. And as you know, if you've listened to my show for any length of time, I am always testing new things because the industry will always be changing. Just like as a human, you have a clear identity. You know who you are, yet you're also always changing. You're always growing. You're always evolving. This is less about being rigid or right or wrong or set in stone, being like, okay, this is my identity. And I'm never going to change it, right? Like, no, it's not about that, but it's about being clear on who you are, what your podcast is about, what do you stand for, who is your show for, what specific problems do you solve, and how are you looking to make your name known in this space? It's also about being experimental, being willing to test, staying open-minded. So as we go forward in the podcasting space over these next few years, here's a few things that I anticipate will happen. Number one, specificity will outperform. I talk a lot on the show here about specificity, and there's a reason why. Because it significantly outperforms in today's digital age. This is no different from a Brené Brown bestseller versus a college textbook. Specificity sells. So my prediction is that we're going to see more independent niche podcasts. Because if you aren't a celebrity, if you're not backed by a huge network, if you're not pumping hundreds of thousands of advertising dollars into your podcast, going niche is going to be one of the, if not the only way to stand out. Also, we're going to continue seeing innovation in how we listen to podcasts. This is already happening. Many podcasts are not just audio anymore. We're also seeing this multimedia approach where a lot of podcasts now are incorporating video, live streaming, interactive elements, supplementary content, content on social media platforms, extended content, bonus content. But my prediction is that, yes, we will continue to see this change happen in how we listen to podcasts, but more importantly, we're going to see innovation in podcast content itself. I think we're getting really close to being done with the days of traditional interview style podcasts. You know, the ones where you're like, oh, I'm so happy to have you here on the show. Now, look, for our listeners who don't understand who you are and your story, I'd love to have you just take us back in time. Tell us, where were you when you first started, and how has that impacted your ability to get to where you are now? Like, okay, we don't need to hear another person's origin story, right? Like, I can go my entire life without needing another origin story. Why? Because listeners are more savvy. Consumers are more savvy. I am not going to be invested in the story that you want to tell me until you first show me that you understand the problem that I'm experiencing that you say you're here to help me solve. It's no different than walking into the doctor's office, and let's say the doctor is a specialist in, gastrointestinal pain, and you walk in with a stomach ache. And suddenly the doctor's like, oh, honey, I get it. I have struggled with this my entire life. In fact, back in 1932, my great-grandfather had this. It's a genetic condition, and my grandfather, and here's how it affected. And you're like, okay, but I'm here about me today, doctor. Okay, can we talk about me for a minute? You don't care about the doctor's story until they show you that they understand the pain you're in. Now, on the flip side of that, if that doctor was to sit down and really take their time with you and ask questions and diagnose you and tell you exactly what's going on, and then lend a story to reinforce what they're telling you and offer that comfort, you'd welcome the story because you'd be like, yeah, okay, that was what I needed to hear. Thanks. It makes me feel better that I'm not the only one going through this. And the same is true for listeners. Again, tolerance levels have changed. What we used to tolerate in a 35, 45, 55-minute episode with someone droning on about their personal history for 20 minutes, we don't tolerate anymore. So my prediction is that we're going to see people moving away from traditional interview-style podcasts and taking more creative liberties with their content. On-site recordings, adventure-based recordings, new and innovative recording styles designed to capture attention. Now, this is already happening in the entertainment type of podcasts. But for the educational podcasts, I believe they're going to follow suit. I think we're going to have to in order to keep people's attention and to keep people engaged. And then the final prediction that I anticipate happening is that these networks, they're going to continue to grow. They're not going anywhere. But I also think that we're going to see a rise against the network, just like we're starting to see in the music industry right now, where more and more people are going to want to go independent, to be free from these network constraints. Just like indie musicians are leveraging platforms like Spotify and social media to build awareness, podcasters are also going to seek to maintain their creative freedom, their ownership, their control over their content. It's no different than Connor Price and 100 Gram and Forrest Frank. And we're going to see the same thing happening in the podcasting space. So the big question here, in light of this, is what can you do to make sure that your podcast can evolve and withstand the test of time? And again, it goes back to knowing who you are, knowing who you podcast for, and to not be afraid to take creative risks with your content, because now is the time to experiment. And if you don't feel like your podcast is performing right now in the way that you want it to, or your listeners aren't engaged as you want them to be, or if you're about to launch a podcast and you want to be sure that you're being specific enough in who you're targeting and how you're communicating to them, and give yourself the best possible chance to succeed, and if you want my help to do it, then head to the show notes, grab a time on our calendar, and chat with my team, and we'll talk about what it looks like to work together and how we might be able to help you. And speaking of taking ownership of your podcast identity, sometimes that does inevitably mean a rebrand. And in the next episode, I'm going to take you behind the scenes to show you the before and after of a recent podcast rebrand, and you are going to be absolutely floored by the results. All this is coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.